those of you who got
Got
here
it.
really early, I'm going to give you a sneak peek. Alex has a new video dropping tomorrow on some
Yeah. Yeah.
monitoring tools. Figure that's something I can mention while you
Yeah.
sort out the YouTube stuff.
We're live on YouTube. We
All
are
right.
all good to go. So welcome in YouTube people. We've got a couple of live streams running right now. We've got the YouTube side, obviously. Hello, if you're watching us there. We've got also a Zoom webinar running as well. So I'll be monitoring the chat in both places for questions and comments and concerns and thoughts and that kind of thing. But my name's Alex. Those of you that are on Zoom have already heard this bit, but I'm from Tailscale and I do developer relations here. Oh, I need to turn my reactions off for this. Why does macOS not have a global way to turn off reactions yet? Anyway, I'm Alex. Hi, nice to meet you. Joining me today is Jay.
Hi, I'm Jay. I'm on the solutions engineering team here at Tailscale. So I work a lot with our customers to help them get Tailscale implemented initially and to help work new features into their environment. So specifically, any questions that you have about implementation are probably coming at me. If you have questions about home lab, Docker, that sort of thing, I'm definitely going to hand them uh, back to Alex there.
I did see Mike Hansen in the chat already mentioning the new Tailscale and Unraid partnership that went live in the last week or two.
Hmm.
That's a big deal. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, I've got some hardware on the way to test out Unraid in my own home lab. My home lab is not quite as extensive as yours, but I do like to putter.
I'll say, here's the thing, right? Like my home lab, over the years, it was just a media server, right?
Hmm.
And it started off as just an old desktop that I recycled into an Unraid box and then added a couple of hard drives into. And then I started putting Plex on there and you know how it goes. And now obviously doing this stuff for work, you know, in the YouTube video capacity that I do, I've got to have a separate set of infrastructure so that I can actually create Tailscale infrastructure that's not already on my LAN. Otherwise, I don't need Tailscale for that.
Right.
Like, you know, it's a whole thing. But anyway, home labbing can mean many different things to many different people. It can be just a small form factor Dell 1 liter PC, or it can be 1,000 watt 42U server rack in your garage. You know, it's and anywhere in between. So
Yeah, and we definitely have some staff at Tailscale who fall on the far end of that spectrum. You know, I've
yeah.
got a Synology and half a dozen Raspberry Pis. We can think of one of our engineers who has at least three racks in their house. So,
Well, I've got some work to do then to catch
mhm.
up, huh? All right, so no questions come through on the Zoom side yet. Please feel free to use the Q&A section if you're on Zoom watching today. There are, however, a few questions already popping up in the YouTube chat, so let's get to some of those, shall we?
Mhm.
Kevin Riordan writes in, can you discuss how node sharing works? How do you prevent IP conflicts? And are there any limitations when scaling node sharing?
So yes, but first I'll talk about the IP infrastructure. And when you log a machine into Tailscale, it gets both a IPv6 address and an IPv4 address. The IPv4 address is in the CGNAT space. It's 100.64/10 is the CIDR that we're drawing from. The IPv4 addresses are unique within a tailnet. So if you share a node to a friend's tailnet, it will try and have the same address. If there is an IP conflict, a device on that tailnet already has that address. I mean, it's a /10, so the odds are still in our favor, but it will just roll a new IPv4 address that's going to be used in the context of that tailnet. The IPv6 addresses are globally unique, so those are always going to be able to be identified. So if you are, say, sharing a node with somebody who may be a little less technically proficient, you can paste them. a URL or something that contains the IPv6 address, and you know that's going to be the same on their tailnet.
The other thing, and just this is just to add on to what Jay was saying, really, is that no node sharing can be a double-edged sword. So if you start involving things like tagging, you start having to you start running into issues with who owns the node specifically. So this is going to deep dive a little bit into kind of like node ownership as part of a tailnet. And by the way, I'm seeing all the questions come through on YouTube. Thank you guys. We'll try our best to get to all of them. So node ownership when it comes to node sharing is a bit of a thorny issue. So when you are sharing a node from your tailnet, you as the admin, presumably on that tailnet, are essentially sharing a node with another person. You're not sharing it with a tag or any kind of like service account as part of Tailscale. So there is no mechanism if you have a tagged node to reach that from another tailnet. So if you have a node tagged as say server, you couldn't then reach a node that's been shared into your tailnet because the node wasn't shared with the tag owner, it was shared with you as the person. It's a little bit confusing, so there's some nuance there. But in terms of scaling, Jay's perfectly right that we do our best not to overlap. I mean, the CG NAT space we use has I forget how is it a /16 size?
/10.
Slash
So
10. Wow.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
it's a metric lot. Yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot. I think it's about 4 million addresses or
that
something to choose
sounds
from.
about right. But unfortunately, our sharing infrastructure doesn't quite scale that way. I believe we have a limit of 10 uh, external users that you can share a node with, but it's been a while since I've peeked deeply into that part of the product. So if somebody else knows better than me on that, please chirp up in the chat.
All right. So I think that covers off node sharing. And the next question that came in is from JGFC. Is there a way to use ACLs to allow only Tailscale clients to VNC into a Mac Mini, but not other users on the local network?
So not exclusively through ACLs. Tailscale manages permissions across the Tailscale network. So you would need to have something like a local firewall on the system, or if you put that Mac Mini in a separate VLAN on your network that doesn't have that local access but still has a route to the internet, then the only way of getting to it will be through Tailscale, and you can do that fine grain controls via the ACLs. But we sort of stay in our lane and we don't try to do any uh, LAN level access controls on your network.
I think the real part of that question that kind of stumped me a little bit um, was specifically around like you've got a bunch of clients that are registered through Tailscale, and they have a known origin IP space, as we just talked about, as part of that 4 million wide /10 block of IPv4 addresses, right? So every client, you could write firewall rules that says allow from this /10 and we'll be good to go. The problem you'll run into is that unless you know the origin of these VNC connections as being, LAN addresses of let's say 192.168 dot whatever, you could probably put firewall rules in place to prevent 192.168 origins. But it just depends really how you've built your network and how you've designed it really as to how that would work. Now, if you want to get a little bit fancy in the Tailscale world, you can start using our more advanced ACLs called grants. And grants will allow you to very granularly pick protocols and specific ports, allowing traffic from certain tags and certain origin siders and that kind of thing. Only in the Tailscale world, like it won't, unless it's going through a subnet router, of course, route things that are going from your LAN. Like if Tailscale's not involved, Tailscale's
Mhm.
not involved, right? So grants are a really useful thing. I've only just started playing with them over Christmas, but I've now got a bunch of nodes tagged on my network that can only see half of the rest of the tailnet because of grants. And It's really cool. I'll make a video about it in the upcoming quarter or so. I promise.
Mhm.
But
With
that's how I do it.
Yeah, with certain services, especially in the Linux world, you can usually bind a service to an interface as well.
Hmm.
I don't know specifically about VNC in Mac OS. I'm not familiar with a mechanism to do that, but that's something to keep in mind as the general gist of that question rather than the specific.
Yeah, I don't know. Running server grade services on Mac OS is it's fun. Launch is a whole animal of its own. So we had a question come through on Zoom, which kind of speaks a little bit to the answer I just gave about grants. So I'm going to kind of hijack that one in the queue a little bit. My name is Arpad, and I'm trying out Tailscale at work. Thank you for putting this meeting together. I was wondering what is the best way to partition your devices into separate tailnets? In other words, I want different servers to be isolated from each other. So I can't speak to multi-tailnet stuff, but I can certainly we can certainly discuss a little bit how, Jay, you might go about partitioning up a single tailnet into multiple slices.
Yeah, and this is something I specifically work a lot with our customers in healthcare and finance and other high compliance industries because that's what my background was before I came to Tailscale. So one of the big strengths of our ACL policy engine is that it is deny by default. Now, we ship with one rule in your tailnet by default, and that is allow everybody to do everything, which is fantastic for testing things out. It's usually okay in your home lab, and it's terrifying in production. So, I often will work with our customers to pull that rule out and get very specific. And when you've defined the relationships between users and computers, it's really between computers and computers, but anything that isn't defined there, not only can they not communicate with each other, but they can't enumerate each other either. So there's no relationship defined in the policies between two computers. They can't see each other. They don't know each other exists. So that allows for some pretty rigid siloing within a single tailnet. Something that the engineers are digging into now and is starting to get tested out in some corners is various ways of having multiple tailnets that are going to be owned by the same organization and look for more information and for those to be hitting like a public beta probably in 4 or 5 months.
Is that a super secret pre-release promise right there that
Yeah,
we have accidentally released on live stream? Oops.
yeah.
Well, there you go.
I,
That's why
I,
you
I
show up to live
promised
streams.
nothing.
That's why you show up to live streams,
Yeah.
people. Yeah, multi-tailnet stuff is well, as Jay just said, coming soon. Watch this space.
Mhm.
We'll make some noise about it when it lands, I promise. The other thing you can do is in addition to everything Jay just said is use grants to kind of a mixture of grants and tags to split things up, based on roles and say
Mhm.
this server is, let's say you've got an uptime Kuma instance, for example, that wants to reach out over your tailnet to do a bunch of pings. Well, that server doesn't need access to every single TCP port under the sun, does it? It just needs ICMP to be allowed. So you could
Mhm.
write a grant rule that says uptime Kuma is allowed to ICMP everywhere on my tailnet, but nothing else. And because it's a default deny model implicitly, unless you allow something, it's denied. So
And with our new, it's been around for a while now, but so have I. So I still think of it as new. Uh, our policy engine and specifically our just-in-time part of the policy engine also allows you to have uh, things that are very locked down, but a user could request access to a set of resources for a fixed amount of time. And we have a Slack bot that they could use to do that. Or if you're running Jira or Zendesk or something that can make API calls, we can integrate that with the API. And it could be like, I want to SSH into production to make some changes. Please grant me that access for an hour. And then that access appears, I can see that device, I can log in and do my work. When that hour is up and those permissions expire, we go back to me not being able to see that device. It just disappeared off the network for
Oh,
me.
I didn't know about that. That's pretty cool. There you go. So this is why I show up to live streams because I learn stuff too. This hopefully Ben Smith on the YouTube side covers off your question about multi-tail nets and the investigation we're putting into that. So watch this space. We will have some news for you at some point this year, I hope. Now, there's another question here from Kuno Wout on YouTube saying, can I freely choose the name for my tailnet?
Uh, Not really.
Yeah, yeah, but no, but.
Yeah. You can, of course, you're assigned tail random number.ts.net. Uh, and this is on by default. You can also roll what we call a fun name that is something with tails dash something with scales.ts.net.
Do you know how those are generated?
Yes, we have a list in GitHub that you can contribute to. You can open a PR on our Tails and Scales lists on our public GitHub. If you think that there is something with scales or something with tails that ought to be on that list for selection. Um, you know, the refining that name is something that some of our enterprise customers have access to, but for home users, self-serve users, you're either going to have to get lucky or use that somewhat generic tail random number.ts.net.
My personal tailnet that I use for all the demos for Tailscale is Velociraptor hyphen noodlefish. So,
I
you can
mean,
get
can't
a
get
little
much
bit.
better than that.
It's pretty good.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's certainly better than tail
Mhm.
abc123.ts.net anyway. But I should add that all of that stuff that Jay just talked about is completely free in terms of like the funny name generators that we have, the word lists as well you can contribute to on GitHub if you'd like to add something that's missing. That's available to all customers, paid or free. Obviously, if you're a paying business customer, there are a couple more bells and whistles available for you, but that's just the
And
way of the world.
Interesting side note, one of the reasons why we do that randomized address is when you pull a TLS certificate or HTTPS certificate through Tailscale, which is generated by Let's Encrypt, uh, that information goes into a publicly accessible certificate transparency log. And not every one of our customers wants people to know, oh, I saw, a tailscale.com server that is called this. Maybe I'm finding some information about that, but we give a layer of obfuscation by default.
Right. And if you're curious to actually see the ledger of all these different certificates that are generated through Let's Encrypt, you can go to a website called crt.sh. You can literally just type ts.net in there. It'll take a while because we generate a lot of certificates, and that will pull a list of all the certificates that get generated. So there is a warning in the Tailscale dashboard that says if you want to enable HTTPS, be aware that it goes on a public record. So, as Jay says, perhaps you might just want to just be aware that that's the case. Like, I don't think it's really that much of a security risk if you're outside of like a big corporate setting because, well, the traffic's only routable when you're on your tailnet anyway because of how WireGuard works. But yeah, just something to be aware of. Now, we did have a couple of other questions come through in relation to certificates. One asking about the fact that Let's Encrypt is just added, I think it's a temporary or sort of short-lived certificate, sort of 5, 6, 7 days certificates. Do we plan to support those? And then also from Remix Dave on YouTube, do we plan to support wildcard certificates from Let's Encrypt?
Mhm. So for the short-lived certificates, I'm not sure. It's not something I've heard about, but it's something that Alex and I'll bring back to the team and say, hey, we heard some interest about this. Uh, and the wildcard subdomains, as far as I know, we're not handling that. Alex, you might know better than me on that one.
No, I don't think so because the Let's Encrypt mechanism that happens is it happens per instantiation of serve or funnel.
Mhm.
And The assumption there is that not every service is going to be served and not every service is going to be funneled.
Mhm.
And it's actually more secure to have a per service certificate anyway. I it just, I don't think there'll be any benefit really for the end user in going for a wildcard cert. It's not like you're running your own reverse proxy, in which case you're free to do with whatever you like in that regard. But here, just in order to maintain standards across the board and not have any, you generate a wildcard certificate, then you've got to store it somewhere, and then you've got to copy it across all the other hosts, yada, yada, yada. Whereas when it's generated as part of the service instantiation, it gets stored locally in the context of that service, and everybody's happy, I think. So hopefully that answers the question. All right. So, goodness me, you lot have been asking a lot of questions today. Fantastic. Okay. So, Mike Brennan writes on Zoom, can I bridge two tailnets together by running Tailscale on one machine and a Docker container on another tailnet? I think this might work for comms from the host to the Docker container, but won't allow communications from the Docker container to the host's network.
Yeah. Uh, so Tailscale is a layer three routing protocol, and we tend to use OS level tools to do most things. So in like a Linux environment where you have a lot of access to the low level uh, NF tables or IP tables rules, you could, in theory, set up some forwarding. The problem is going to be adding routes to the other machines. Uh, it would have to be done with subnet routers because Tailscale uh, devices only talk to peers that are in their ACLs by default. So I'll say it's a can of worms. If you're really looking for a project to prove that it can be done, that might be a fun way of spending a weekend. If you're the sort of nerd that thinks that home networking is fun, guilty. But if you're trying to do this in a production environment, I would say talk to our team. There's probably a better approach to do what you need to actually do. Like, let's unpack the why before we dive too deeply into the how.
Yep, I don't have anything to add to that answer, so I'm going to jump to the next question from Dimitar Stratiev, asking, can a funnel connection from a non-tailscaler be a direct connection and not traverse a derp server? Is there a general rule of thumb that can tell us if a particular type of connection would end up being derped or end up being direct?
Okay, I'm going to treat those as two questions. The funnel connections that are coming in don't necessarily traverse a derp server, but they will traverse our funnel proxy. All of the publicly facing part of that funnel connection is Tailscale infrastructure. So we're not actually exposing a port on your home machine to the public internet. We are building a tunnel from a Tailscale control resource to your machine, and that resource has a open port on the public internet. So it's really a proxied connection either way.
Right. Essentially, we host a reverse proxy for you on our infrastructure, which then has the know-how of how to tunnel back to where the origin of the service is. And
Mhm.
so the downside of that approach, of course, well, the upside is it's really stupid simple to get started. Like you type Tailscale funnel service and it's on the internet. The downside is that in order for that front door to exist on the internet for the service to be reachable by non-Tailscale users, we have to proxy all the traffic through that host. And obviously, if we're serving videos or large files through that, the transit costs would become pretty unbearable for Tailscale pretty quickly. So we heavily rate limit traffic that goes through that funneled front door for that reason. And it's one of the other reasons we encourage everybody to install Tailscale and do friends and family and node sharing and all that kind of stuff, is because then you can establish direct connections and not be subject to those limitations.
Mhm. Before we had the funnel feature, I had a proxy running on an inexpensive VPS on my own network. I spun something up on DigitalOcean for $4 or $5 a month, and I ran RINetD on it, which is a proxy service. You could do the same sort of thing with Nginx, and that would let me proxy things onto devices in my tailnet based on those rules. And if you're trying to do something other than serving a relatively low throughput, like webhook endpoint, or a show somebody the preview from your VS Code of a web page that you're working on, that might be a better approach. So if it's something that's got to be weight bearing for higher bandwidth requirements.
Indeed. Now, Gary writes again on the YouTube side, can we define ACLs for devices on a network behind a Tailscale subnet router? We have Tailscale on pfSense to access an internal system. Can ACLs apply in this scenario?
Yes. So the Tailscale of ACL evaluation is done on both ends of the connection. So without an ACL rule to, let's say, 10.10.10.10, my machine would never try and communicate with it, but also the subnet router itself uh, evaluates those ACL rules before forwarding on the packets. So there is the sort of softer edge there that if somebody is on the local network or has another route to that local network, the ACLs can't enforce anything. So there's, you know, not, I wouldn't say it's a hole, but it's certainly something to keep in mind when you're architecting your network, especially if you're concerned about that end-to-end encryption, end-to-end authenticated connections.
I had this kind of situation pop up for me actually, where I ended up creating a network loop for myself between different VLANs and different subnets and all that kind of stuff by hosting more than one subnet router in the same uh, CIDR, same
Hmm.
subnet. And the way I've fixed it is now I've decided that every subnet router in a LAN must be a single purpose machine. So I used to just tag subnet routing alongside my media server or alongside my firewall or whatever it is. But now I'll spin up an LXC container or I'll dedicate a Raspberry Pi to the task of being a subnet router.
Hmm.
And then I will tag it as such. So I will create a tag in my tailnet of tag hyphen tag colon uh, site name hyphen SR. So I know that that tag only exists on the node that is a subnet router. What I can then do inside of my grants function is write a source rule. So I can say auto group members, for example. That'll be every device that's tagged or owned by me. Or indeed, I could have anything that belongs to a certain origin CIDR be the source, and then I can say the destination is the CIDR that I don't want to route through that. It's like I don't want devices on the LAN to route through the subnet router on the LAN to find devices on the LAN, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. And so using grants, I can actually, first of all, I can enforce which subnet router they're using for which specific subnet based on their origin, all that kind of stuff. And you can put non-tailscale CIDRs in there as the destination. So
Hmm.
I hope that helps. Have a play around with grants. They are incredibly powerful. And like I say, I'm fairly new to them myself, but they will probably help you out a great deal in this situation.
And the specific part of grants that Alex was just talking about is called VIA, and the
Mm.
blog article on it is called Route Filtering with VIA. So if you Google that, along with the word Tailscale, it should bring you right there and tell you how to build those route filters.
I should say at this point as well, like doing things like this is quite an advanced topic. So like, don't be put off if you're like listening to what we're talking about and being like, what are these network nerds talking about? Because honestly, like, unless you know you need this stuff, you probably don't need this stuff. So.
Mhm.
Now, question from a mute observer. What's the feasibility of using a mixture of head scale and tail scale? I'm leaning on the tail scale infrastructure first and foremost, am I missing the point here of the two projects, or is this wasteful, or can you talk me through the difference?
It depends on what you're actually trying to do. Head scale is meant to be a replacement for tail scale in certain environments. it's a great project, and everybody around here is a big fan of what the community's been able to do there. But you can't really use head scale and tail scale at the same time. You can have your Tailscale client on your machine connected to a Tailscale server and use fast user switching to flip over and connect to a head scale network. So you can move between them fairly fluidly. But there's not a supported mechanism to really have connections to both at once.
So what is head scale for? Who is it for? Like talk us through a little bit what head scales,
Yeah. So Headscale is a community project that was developed independently of Tailscale, not by, well, I should say it wasn't initially developed by anybody who works for Tailscale, but we ended up hiring one of them, so now it kind of is, but it is still uh, an independent project. And uh, it is meant to be a fully open source drop-in replacement for our coordination server, which is the part of Tailscale that we run software as a service. It's great for home users. It's great for experimenting. It's usable in smaller business environments. From talking to the members of our team that have used it quite extensively, I don't expect that you'd be scaling head scale up to, you know, many hundreds or thousands of users. But if you have 5 or 6 users, it's probably something that is worth looking at if the couple bucks a month is more important to you than the time, or if you just want to do it as a project because it's this sort of thing that's kind of fun if you're that kind of nerd.
So what's the control plane for on the tail scale side? Because that's what head scale's trying to emulate and trying to replace, right?
Yeah. Our coordination server for Tailscale basically handles the integrations with your identity provider. So if you wanted to log in with Okta or a Microsoft account or a Google account, or a passkey. All of that is being done on our coordination server. Headscale doesn't have those integrations, so you would have to configure usernames and passwords on there. Uh, mhm,
I think it's worth at this point pointing out. So those of you that have been in the Linux world for a while are probably familiar with the Red Hat Fedora relationship, right?
mhm,
Where you've got the strong and stable RHEL distribution that is, you know, maybe a year or two behind the cutting edge, where the new features don't really land in RHEL. Yes, you'll get bug fixes from Red Hat and all that kind of stuff, but the new shiny stuff lands in Fedora. Well, the situation with Tailscale is a little bit unique. So yes, you can kind of think of these two projects a little bit like that, like Fedora is Headscale and RHEL is Tailscale. But the reality is there's a couple of guys working on Headscale, and for the most part, they're reverse engineering Tailscale APIs and Tailscale features and adding them when they have time into the Headscale project.
mhm,
Whereas Tailscale is a company with 50 engineers or whatever we have at the moment. And, that's a lot more velocity of adding new features. We have enterprise customers asking for stuff. We have free users getting stuff all the time.
mhm,
And so the reality is that in this situation, Headscale's always playing catch up. And I don't mean to say that to be derogatory towards Headscale, because open source is hugely important to me personally, and those of you that know me know that's to be true. But it's just the reality of the situation. 50 people versus a couple, like one's velocity is going to be higher than the other. And as such, I don't really strongly recommend Headscale for anybody very, very strongly, because it's always going to be playing catch up, and it works. And that is a minor miracle in and of itself. But it's a blessed solution. Like I suggest not to use it, but that's not a tail scale recommendation. I just want to be clear,
mhm.
just for the reasons I've articulated here. Like, if you want the latest and greatest cutting edge stuff, just use Tailscale. It's all encrypted. We don't want your data. There's nothing traverses our servers that's really identifiable in any meaningful way. So, from our perspective, you've just got to trust me, bro, I
Yeah.
suppose. I mean, if you trust WireGuard, if you trust public key encryption and all that, cryptography, hopefully you understand that WireGuard's pretty bulletproof by this point. Maybe we should do a webinar on how WireGuard works, a deep dive, huh?
Yeah, I can think of a couple of people on our team that would definitely be better suited for that, hosting that than me, but we can go very deep into it. We've been upstreaming quite a bit of the optimizations that we've made into the WireGuard project as well. We've been doing that since day one. So we have some of our engineers who are, very well versed in WireGuard and its code because they just kind of live there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Those of us that just use the technology can't hold a candle to some of those folks. I see Mike Brennan has already posted a comment on Zoom saying a WireGuard deep dive would be great. All right, Mike, noted. We will add that to the backlog. Don't worry. All right, so a little time check for everybody. We've got maybe 20, 25 minutes left. Still a bunch more questions. So let's try and I'll try and pick up the pace a little bit to make sure we get to everybody's questions. Right. Olivier Forget. Oh, I don't know. I'm going to guess French from Olivier. Anyway, on the Zoom side has written, when I create a node with TSNet, I can see the files it creates on my machine. Can I move these files to a different computer so that the node can start from there? Is that a no-no or something that might actually work?
Okay, so you're running a service that's built with TSNet, and that service is saving files to the local drive, which makes sense because it is a program running in a folder somewhere. Uh, I think
It's
that,
going to be saving things like the private keys for Tailscale and
yeah.
some of the authentication stuff that goes on.
And, and the problem is that if you have two devices that are trying to use the same credentials at the same time, you're going to run into, let's just call it friction. It's not going to work because the control server will basically see it as one machine trying to communicate from two different IP addresses and flap between the two, and you know generally have a pretty terrible user experience. That being said, the identity file is the identity. So if you create a TSNet device, you spin it up, you connect it, you take it down, but keep that identity file, theoretically, you could put that, overwrite another identity file on another machine, bring it up, and it would assume that identity. So if you're thinking of, migrating a service or something like that. It
Right.
isn't how I'd approach it, but that is how it would work under the hood.
In the containerization world, at least, I think what you're referring to here is what we typically call state. So you'd want to make sure that the state of the application is, if it's a stateful one, of course, gets ported with the code. So the idea should be to decouple the application logic from the state storage such that if the application comes up and it's had the rug pulled from it, like I say, it's a completely fresh container install or whatever, it will just go ahead and create the new stuff that it needs and all the rest of it. Whereas if it finds a directory full of state, it'll pick it up. And I think that's the 12-factor app stuff coming back from the dead in my mind. But that's some pretty good basic application architecture principles in there anyway. So Joseph Beams writes in, is it possible to serve multiple services on different ports on a single Tailscale node using Tailscale Serve?
Uh, I've never tried that. Alex, have you run into that?
Well, the answer is unfortunately no,
Hmm.
because Tailscale Serve out of the box at least
Right.
is trying to proxy a service on a specific port internally to the environment it's running in
Mhm.
out typically on port 443. And let's just say that Tailscale Server is running inside a Docker container, an environment that's encapsulated. You can only bind to port 443 once. So typically how we get around this in the air quotes in the real world is by having what's called a reverse proxy or some kind of load balancer that takes in those multiple requests that come through to port 443, examines the headers, and then forwards the requests on to the target destination behind the scenes.
So
So
we probably want to use like our Nginx container image that we've published for something like that.
You could absolutely do that, yeah. Another way to do it would be using something like Caddy and then have Tailscale as a sidecar proxy in there. That could work too. In fact, I've got several videos on YouTube about how to do just that. The other thing that came to mind with this question is a brand new community project called TSD Proxy. And
Yes.
this is essentially a TSNet based application that runs a reverse proxy inside it, written in Go, and it does exactly what you're asking for. You can host with just a couple of extra Docker labels. Okay, it's a Docker-based solution. I love Docker. I'm not going to apologize for that. You can just add a couple of labels to your other containers on the same host, mount the Docker socket, and it will do the rest for you.
It's true. I tolerate Docker. Uh, Alex loves it. I use it because it's necessary, but TSD Proxy is an amazing community project. I'm a big fan of uh, of the fellow who spun that up because it just works. It feels like uh, an extension of what Tailscale ought to be doing. So
Someone in the chat's asking, how do I get a Tailscale t-shirt? Stand by. I'm going to ask internally, see if we have any swag links for you lot that have shown up today. Remix Dave replied, regarding the HTTPS wildcard situation, it would be nice to put a caddy server to one host and wildcard, have the wildcard per machine instead of having to run multiple Tailscale instances. Well, I think that speaks to what we were just talking about a little bit with regards to binding port 443 to multiple services. Like it's just not the way that TCP IP works.
mhm.
So the wildcard cert would solve um, the certificate side of that problem, but it wouldn't solve the packet routing and inspection of the headers to forward the traffic on to the desired service part of that request. So uh, TSD proxy is probably the simplest answer for you guys.
Yeah, because TSD Proxy will pull a cert for each of the services that it's proxying.
Indeed, it will. Okay, so where should we go next? We haven't had a YouTube one in a while. So, do we know anything about the Tailscale support for multicast or MDNS?
Yeah, Tailscale operates at layer 3, and that is from bottom to top. We are a layer 3 routing protocol. Multicast is a layer 2 protocol. So if you're need to bone up on your OSI model, on honestly the 2, 3, and 7 is the extent of the OSI model that I spend a lot of time in, but it isn't possible with our current architecture to do multicast. What I have heard of people doing is using something called a multicast repeater that listens for multicast packets on layer 2, bundles them into a UDP packet, sends it to a client on another network, which unbundles them and sends them back out as multicast. It's not something that we've done a lot of support for, but I've had customers tell me that they used it for things like these older style game servers or licensing servers or things like that.
I mean, the downside, of course, to having multicast enabled would be that Chromecasts at my mum's house would show up in my network here too. So,
I could think of ways of being quite mischievous with that, actually.
careful what you wish for. Yeah, so there are a couple of GitHub issues as well on this topic. It's been a request we've had many times over the years. And essentially, it just comes down to a supply and demand type situation. At the moment, there isn't enough public demand for such a feature. If you are adamant that Tailscale must add multicast or MDNS functionality, please go ahead. I'll put a link to the GitHub issue actually in the chat. Please go ahead and comment on that thread. That's the best way to get your voice heard. In certainly in terms of engineering language that engineers understand, is to post onto a GitHub issue and say that you know, we want this to happen. Essentially, the tricky part comes, like Jay was saying, because of the OSI layer model in networking. Multicast happens at a layer below WireGuard, so like we'd have to do bit of magic with the repeaters and stuff like that. Like we have to re-implement a lot of stuff from scratch, and it's not a small lift. It's essentially what I'm trying to say. And engineers aren't cheap, so yeah, there you go. So I'm going to put that link on the YouTube chat right now. If this is super important to you, please let us know. And that applies to anything, not just multicast, but anything you think, why doesn't Tailscale do this? Let us know. I mean, we are here. Like, you can talk to us, you can ask us questions, you can post things in our GitHub, in our social medias, all the rest of it. We do read them, we do look at them, you know. So, all right, let's jump into another question on the Zoom side. Mike Brennan writes, what are your plans around making policy modification changes less based on JSON? I'd love to have some kind of a policy agent engine or something else.
Yeah. There's I'm I'm gonna peel back the hood a little bit and let you know that there's a couple of different ways that this is being discussed, and we've done some basic testing internally for things like an ACL GUI. Some of our users who are like, hey, I've set up Tailscale. I want my service desk people to be able to do everything from here on, and they don't like working with JSON. Can we just have a click ops type of solution? Uh, that is a pretty big lift because our ACL policy syntax it's been growing over the many years. Uh, the other thing that we have been talking about internally is a type ahead for that ACL editor in our web UI, and I think that that is going to be uh, really valuable if we go down that road just for the speed. Like I'm pretty comfortable with our ACL engine. I spend a lot of time looking at people's ACL files and helping troubleshoot and that sort of thing. And I think that the type ahead approach will be quite valuable. Of course, we're always interested in ideas that other people are having as well. But a lot of our customers, as they scale up, are also managing their ACLs in things like GitOps or in Terraform. And whatever we do moving forward, we have to make sure that we're not breaking compatibility with that sort of more enterprisey, more infrastructure as code approach to things.
And that's how Windows ended up with 12 control panels that all look the same, but operate slightly differently with slightly different levels of Chrome on top of them. I put a link to the GitOps stuff for managing your ACLs in the various chats that Jay was just talking about. Do you want to speak a little bit to what that means?
Uh, so the GitOps, basically, we work with a lot of software companies, as you could probably guess. A tool like Tailscale is very useful for companies that have a lot of developers, and a lot of these companies live in Git, and that is where they manage most of what they do. So being able to have the access control policy file live in Git as well means that they can use code owners and use existing workflows to manage how the network looks once it's been applied. And under the hood, what it's really doing is that GitOps runner is making an API call to our open API. So much like our Terraform provider would do or our Pulumi provider would do, um, it's it's all under the hood doing the same action, but it lets you use the tooling that you already have built out in your environment.
Mike Brennan also adds a little bit more color to this question in the chat as well, talking about some of the zero trust angles of using policy engines to manage these kinds of essentially firewall rules at this point. Like if you're
Mhm.
using Tailscale heavily enough, these ACLs are basically analogous to firewall rules, certainly in a software-defined networking rule. He says that we can get some of this with Sentinel-1 and postures, but it would be nice to have it more open.
Yeah, and we have had a couple of people talking about these open policy agent approaches. This would be a pretty big shift for us, but it's certainly a conversation that comes up now and then. So I don't have an answer for that, but I can tell you it's on our radar.
So what's the best way? I know the live stream is a great way to provide feedback, but
Mhm.
what are some other ways that folks can get in touch with us, particularly if they have sort of more business, sort of more bring to work questions like that?
Yeah. If you're already engaged with somebody on our sales team, working with your account manager or account executive would be a great way of doing that, or somebody from my team on solutions engineering. If you are a self-serve customer or not a customer yet, or you're a free user, uh, filing issues on GitHub will get the attention of our engineering leadership, and our product team spends quite a bit of time there. And for uh, things about implementation and how to make these features work, our support team, of course, is available as well. And there's a contact/support um, page there where you can fill out a form.
I always feel a bit bad. Like I often see YouTube comments asking for support underneath my videos, and I'm like, this isn't the right place to get into a technical support discussion. So yeah, support at tailscale.com, I think, is the best way to get support. There's also a link in the chat for our contact sales form at tailscale.com/contact/sales. Lawrence Nguyen writes in, how can I set up a no split VPN? In other words, all traffic routes through the tailnet.
Uh, There, there's a feature that we call exit nodes. And if you spin up an exit node, you have the option in the client to enable an exit node, and that will route all of your publicly routable traffic through that node before egressing to the internet. So like last year when I was at Black Hat, I set an exit node at my home because I didn't trust the Wi-Fi or the cell towers or anything. I got very paranoid. And all of my traffic came to my house before egressing to the internet. Um, you also can optionally, with a flag, allow local network traffic while using an exit node and only route the publicly routable blocks.
You could also do something like split DNS,
Mhm.
where I appreciate the question was, how do I route all traffic through Tailscale? But sometimes you just want to route most traffic through Tailscale. Another way to do it is something called app connectors.
Mhm.
You
Yeah,
familiar
app
with those?
connectors let you route by FQDN in much the same way that a subnet router would let you route by CIDR or IP block. Um, and if, for instance, you are using a SaaS service that does IP allow listing, you can use an app connector, much like you would an exit node, and say anything for github.com routes through this machine before going out to the internet. Then when it hits GitHub, they see the referring IP address. And if you have the GitHub Pro plan, you can do IP allow listing on certain repos, and it'll determine whether or not to even let somebody try and log in or not based on that value.
Right, we have maybe 5 minutes left, so let's try and quick fire a few more questions before we run out of time. Can I use Tailscale as a remote desktop RDP replacement?
You can use it to connect to an RDP. So we don't do RDP the way that we do SSH, but if you have an RDP server, you can use Tailscale to connect to it remotely. Next.
Is it possible to add a kill switch feature similar to commercial VPNs when using public Wi-Fi and exit nodes?
Is it possible? Probably. I don't believe we've got anything like that on our roadmap right now, but that would be a great thing to file a GitHub feature request for if such a thing does not already exist, or go give a thumbs up to the issue if it does exist.
Absolutely. Brian McDonald writes, is there a way to set QoS priority for Tailscale for services like Veeam backup and other bandwidth intensive tasks when they're traversing a tailnet?
That is not something that we can, pardon me, currently do with Tailscale. That is something that you could do on the OS level of your backup server, though, is to say set uh, QoS limits on the network interface based on time of day or something like that. But out of the scope of Tailscale as far as right now.
Next question is, I think one for me because I use OpenSense. So this one is asking, do pfSense and Tailscale play well together? on the whole network level, bringing an entire network into the tailnet on the router level. How good of an idea is this approach realistically? It's pretty good, actually. I mean, I've been running OpenSense. I actually switched out to a Unify UDM Pro about 2 or 3 months ago. But before then, I'd run OpenSense for about 7 or 8 years non-stop. And before that, PFSense for a decade when I used to do stuff with cable modems in college. Anyway, let's not talk about that. Um, in terms of running Tailscale on the firewall, it's great because the firewall has visibility, you would imagine, to the entire network. Like it can route packets anywhere and everywhere. I think on PFSense there's a plugin that you can configure Tailscale through the GUI. I know that OpenSense recently, a chap, I think is it Mike Sheridan? I think his name was, a guy from I think Yorkshire, in England, wrote a plugin for OpenSense. So you can now configure that through the GUI as well. Of course, you can do it. They're all BSD based, and it's a Go program. So as long as Go runs on a recent version of Go, then Tailscale should run too. You might run it into some weirdness with like mounting the DevNet TUN device for performance reasons and what have you, but I don't believe it to be a problem. There are some things to bear in mind with UDP acceleration on BSD in particular. So if you're trying to do deep packet inspection or any kind of craziness with huge amount like terabytes worth of data at 5 gigabit upload speeds or whatever for offsite replications or whatever, you might run into some UDP acceleration issues on lower power hardware. Just something to be in mind. But
Mhm.
no, go ahead, install Tailscale on your firewall. Have at it. It's a great time. All
Right.
right. What's the oh, we've done that one. I was going to say feasibility of mixing head scale and tail scale together.
Yeah, I did drop answer for Mitch into chat. You asked some follow-up questions about just in time. Uh, so if you didn't spot that, you can read my point on that. Are we going to squeeze in one or two more before we run out of time here?
I think so. Yeah, I'm just trying to spot them all because I'm looking in multiple different
Yeah.
spots. So, how can I set up tail scale to print to my printer at home when I'm at the office?
Yeah, a couple of ways of doing this. If you have a machine that's always on at home, of course, if you install the printer as a network printer on that machine, you'll be able to access that over Tailscale if that machine is running Tailscale. Or you can have that machine act as a subnet router if your printer is a native network printer. Like mine over in the corner there, I've got a Brother Laser, uh, and I can print to it from my phone through a subnet router. What you won't be able to do is that automatically find my printer. That is one of those multicast tools that we were talking about earlier. You'll have to know the IP address of the printer and install it manually in order to print across a subnet router.
Okay. And DIY Dad asks, how can I make site-to-site VPN configuration easier with Tailscale? Currently, I find myself mucking around with routing tables too much. Thank you.
Yeah, site to site is not what Tailscale was originally designed for. And we have some documentation on how you can do it. But because with a normal subnet router, that subnet router is doing what we call source NAT, so that that local connection that isn't running Tailscale only knows that it's talking to the subnet router, and the subnet router handles all of the routing. If we turn off that source NAT so that we can have that symmetric thing between two subnet routers and the networks attached to them, we have to manually add routing rules. Uh, and it's the nature of the beast, I'm afraid, is that if we turn off source NAT, we have to have some other way of telling the packets where to go. And that is either through a VPC configuration, DHCP, or at the OS level, setting those return path routes.
Indeed. Who doesn't like telling packets where to go on occasion? So I think that will do us for today. My goodness, we got to a lot of questions, and I actually started whilst we were talking an internal thread on multicast in the engineering Slack. It's blown up while my notifications have gone bananas whilst we've been on the stream. So I don't think you're alone in wanting multicast support with Tailscale, and certainly from an engineering problem-solving perspective, I think you've got some people's brains whirring this afternoon. So thanks for bringing that up, bring that to our attention. Where can folks find a bit more of you, Jay, if they want to find more Jay?
So I am on the socials. I'm on JWS at InfoSec Exchange on the Mastodon. I'm on Blue Sky with just my name. If you have questions, you can always email the SE team at se@tailscale.com. And especially if you've already got a relationship with somebody on our sales team, that's a great way of communicating. If you're looking to start that conversation, sales@tailscale.com is a good kicking off place for that.
As always, you can find me at the Tailscale YouTube channel. There'll be a video coming out maybe today, maybe tomorrow, about lightweight server monitoring using a brand new monitoring tool called Bezel. Prometheus and Grafana, watch out. And you can go to alex.ktz.me to find all of the other places that I am on these here internets. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. I've been Alex from Tailscale.
And I've been Jay, also from Tailscale.
Have a
Bye.
great afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Bye bye.